All right, hey guys, my name is Michael Miller. My student number is 09888, and this is my showcase for EUB343, Professional Experience Informing Professional Practice. My tutor during this semester was Mrs. Elise Bray, and I had her on a Tuesday afternoon. So the school and classroom context. So our school was a co-educational state high school, which was one of one within the public funded surroundings. And because of it wasn't in a rural school, was the reason for this. With approximately 730 students, and it was in its first year of PBL implementation. So our classroom context was Year 10 History. It was a mixed ability class, 24 students in the class, and it was a BYOD school. However, it wasn't very reliable, so designing learning experiences around laptops wasn't the best of things to do. So our key learning intention was based off our CARA descriptor of overviewing the causes and course of World War II. So our elaboration was outlining the contributing factors of World War II. Supplementary to this, our key historical concepts that we had to explore were significance and cause and effect. And to do this, our key learning intention for the learning experiences was to understand that the appeasement policy was significant in causing World War II. So here we've got our first pre-assessment / diagnostic assessment. So it was completed in 12 minutes of the last lesson prior to me taking over the full class. So I did this in the last lesson that my supervisor teacher had the attendance with. Basically, it just asked questions about their previous learnings and knowledge. So they'd already looked at the Treaty of Versailles, the Roaring Twenties, the Great Depression, etc. And this was to ask them questions of that. It was a diagnostic written response quiz. It was, I've already said it was to gauge student learning. Developing texts and response to stimulus questions is a key learning goal of the unit. So I, designed the test around that key learning goal. And so students were not warned of assessment, but they were instructed of its purpose, and that was to check learning and to inform my practice. So students were given 12 minutes to complete the worksheet. 5 students were away during this time. And, we've got student 13 over here, did a really good job on summarising, answering the questions rather. And we've got feed forward given in the red pen to the students, and I gave them this feedback straight away, the next lesson as part of timely feedback. So key criteria for question 1 was just identifying the Treaty of Versailles, Great Depression, rise of Hitler / fascism, and change during the time. Done that really well. Key criteria 2, Germany to blame, and outlines the restrictions. Done that really well with a bit of exception on detail. And any information that was relevant for question 3, and it had nothing. Now this is the key learning area for our experiences. And that was a common factor that we see here in the yellow. Basically, none bar 4 students had any idea what appeasement was. And within the rest of the data, we see that a lot of students had a lot of knowledge gaps. And basically, the recommendation from this was to revise the previous learning experiences. So we did that we did that from the data, and we just looked at PowerPoint summaries and textbook work to reaffirm their knowledge before we moved on, scaffolding learning, I guess. And a Kahoot game was used to check at the end of this process to check if they understood. And 90% of the questions, of the responses to the questions were correct. So 162 out of 190. Out of 180 rather, which is pretty significant. So this is the data that we've got here from that Kahoot game. Disregard the response numbers. They aren't student specific, they're all random, so you can't really get anything out of that. But basically from this, the students were seen to be ready to move on. And this category here was about the appeasement policy, so still a lack of understanding there. All right, so our learning experiences, lesson 1 was the appeasement policy and the events of 1934 to 39, and I gave them the formative handout, assessment 1, formative assessment 1 handout. Lesson 2, basically we built on that knowledge from the previous learning experience, but we looked at it through sources rather than PowerPoints this time. And the sources, text, cartoons, videos, etc. And we looked at checking for understanding through class discussions there. Then lesson 3, we've got the appeasement, poster creation, and extended response. And that essentially requires students to synthesize evidence, conduct research, and create a written response. So our formative assessment 1, we had the students were given 7 minutes to complete question 1 at the end of lesson 1 after doing those PowerPoints. Student 13, again, really good answer. Lacking a little bit on detail, but other than that, really good. I reflect that in my feed forward. And the key criteria for this one were appeasement, allowing to break the terms of the Treaty of Versailles. The aim was to concede to Hitler, to keep him happy, and the motive was to avoid war. So the feed forward given was just sort of around that, and I've pointed out that they've done the criteria in my feed forward as well, in my feedback. And the students were encouraged, I gave this back on the next lesson, and they were encouraged to use this when they were doing their formative assessment piece 2. So the data generated from formative assessment piece 1 was, we've got our key criteria in red here that we looked at before, but basically students had significant trouble relating the Treaty of Versailles to appeasement, but they didn't really have too much of a trouble relating appeasement to appeasement's goals and its motives. So I gave them that general feedback verbally, and then obviously I gave every student individual comments for feed forward. Again, looking at our diagnostic assessment where they had no idea what appeasement was, this is obviously a large improvement. Right, so our final formative assessment, basically the start of the lesson, the students looked at creating a propaganda style poster where they paired up and they researched appeasement and created an A3 digital resource or A3 paper resource, which they could then use in their final response. And that's really about them taking ownership of their research and of their learning. So in the final 25 minutes of the last learning experience, I gave them this extended response question to do, which essentially asked them in a paragraph to describe the motives and goals of appeasement and evaluate its significance in causing World War II. And I wanted them to give an explicit example of appeasement failing. So student 13, really, really high quality work here. Again, looking at some of the feed forward I gave them, they included down the bottom here some of the motives of appeasement, and a really insightful motive as well. But other than that, it was just about adding a little bit of detail here and there, but a very, very strong response in general. Now, remember, at the start of the diagnostic process, this student had no idea what appeasement was, couldn't put anything down whatsoever. So the data gathered from the final assessment piece across the class, again, with the criteria up here: goals of policy, motives of Britain and France, significance in causing World War II, failures of policy, clear, consistent and cohesive writing techniques used. So our findings from the data are basically almost all students were able to identify the goals of appeasement. Most students were able to identify the motives behind the policy. 2/3 were able to identify its significance to World War II and where appeasement failed. And then about over half were able to do that 5th criteria well. So I gave them verbal feedback that reflected that, especially about the writing criteria. And then I gave them comments and feed forward on their worksheets. And basically I got them to look at the feed forward I gave them in relation to the work they did, and then I showed them each data criteria of their own person. I didn't show them other people's work, obviously for confidentiality reasons, but I showed them, did they do criteria 1 satisfactory, etc., etc. And they had to justify, clarify, challenge, or query about, if the things aligned, if the criteria and the feed forward and the work all aligned. So basically, we can see through this scaffolding of diagnostic assessment, really simple question, simple answers. Well, in this case, weren't too many answers at all. And then here we've got quite a in-depth and just quite an in-depth question and response from the students. So question to the students and quite an in-depth response from most students. Considering most students had limited knowledge 3 lessons ago of appeasement, I believe they've done very, very well to create these extended responses. And in those extended responses, pretty much every single response said the appeasement policy was extremely significant in causing World War II, which is our chief learning goal, which was really encouraging to see that learning over the space of 3 lessons. Here are my references. Thank you.